Thank you very much for the invitation and for having this our paper here. So this is joint work with Daron Simoglu from MIT and Konstantin Sonin from University of Chicago, who is here in this audience. And this is the Tocqueville who inspired this line of research. So our starting point is that inequality is often viewed as a major destabilizing force with respect to democracy, or to put it another way, if inequality is low, democracy is well-functioning and stable. And the reason for that is that if inequality is low, then the middle class, the median person is not sufficiently poor. So because of that, he doesn't, for example, want to overtax the rich. Because of that, the rich don't want to mount a coup, and so this contributes to stability of democracy. But of course, in the real world, there is inequality and sometimes high inequality. And what happens to stability of democracy in this case? Well, the Tocqueville's hypothesis famously says that in this case, it is social mobility that helps makes democracy more stable. So specifically, it occurs elsewhere, but in his book on democracy in America, he talks that when he came from France to America, he found a society where there are no well-defined classes, so there are no well-defined preferences that persist from one generation to another. In contrast, generations consist of very mobile elements. And this idea has been attributed to Tocqueville since then. For example, Lipset saying that institutionalization of widespread individual social mobility, upward and downward, has political consequences, namely the stabilization of democratic order, and he attributes this idea to the Tocqueville. In the interest of time, I should skip the literature review, but I want to emphasize that while there have been famous and influential papers, such as, for example, Binabu and Docs on the link between social mobility, redistribution, and preference for redistribution, there has been very little work on the link between social mobility and institutions, the dynamic of institutions, and perhaps the work by Bahar Leventoglu is a major exception here. Where does this paper stand? So essentially we want to study the link between social mobility and institutions and as you can imagine, in the real world, they influence each other. Of course, social mobility influences institutions and stability of institutions, and that's precisely the Tocqueville's hypothesis. But you might imagine a ton of reasons why institutions might affect social mobility. So for example, in different institutions, different people might decide different social mobility. It might be that institutions, some of them promote economic growth, and different kinds of economic growth create different kinds of opportunities and therefore lead to more mobile, less mobile societies. It might be that some institutions increase in inequality, and inequality itself might generate preference for social mobility. So there are a ton of reasons here, I just named three, but after all, it's not something that our paper focuses on. Our paper focuses on the Tocqueville's hypothesis, which is whether social mobility affects institutions, stability of institutions, or it doesn't. Of course, later on, hopefully I will have time, I will talk a little bit on what if social mobility is also chosen by different people in different institutions. So the main results are as follows. So we show that social mobility makes democracy more stable in the following case: if democracy is the preferred state of people or future selves of the current middle class. On the other hand, if the future selves of the current middle class are likely to prefer some other institution other than democracy, then social mobility would, if anything, make democracy less stable. Furthermore, we have some results on the case where social mobility is chosen by society endogenously, and the punchline there is that there are robust forces that work against social mobility. Specifically, if we talk about social mobility at the top, namely between the middle class and the elite, then such mobility would be opposed by the rich for economic reasons, because they would become poor otherwise, and by the poor for political reasons, because democracy might be destabilized into elite dictatorship. Likewise, social mobility at the bottom might be opposed by the middle class for economic reasons and by the rich for political reasons. Apart from that, we make a few theoretical contributions, which I think are of interest to those of you who are theorists in the audience. So we emphasize two conflicts of interest. One is very well known, which is the conflict between different social groups in the given moment. And the other conflict is between occupants of the same position or the same niche, such as the middle class, at different points in time. We show that the latter conflict may give rise to multiple equilibria, and I will talk about that. Then we show that if, in the case where people are very patient, then the sequence of institutions, the evolution of institutions must converge and will converge to a state that favors the very distant future selves of the current decision maker. And lastly, we talk a little bit about slippery slope. So slippery slope, we have so far thought that slippery slope is something that affects societies in case of where agents are very patient. And slippery slope is that I want to transfer, I want the site to be in some institution, but I don't want to go there because I'm afraid that this institution is unstable and the society will not stay there for long, and therefore I avoid going to this institution. So slippery slope here is present, but not for far-sighted people, but rather for intermediately patient people. Okay. A few words on the model. So we have discrete time and index by t. We have common discount factor for all agents beta. So who are agents? Agents are citizens, a finite number of them, who are split into h social groups consisting of some number of people, and you should probably think of this as the poor, middle class, and rich. For all purposes, the members of each group are identical in each given period, and they have the same instantaneous utility, which is some base level AK, so it just captures that it's better to be rich than to be poor, just naturally, minus they get this dissatisfaction from if the policy that's chosen in this period, for example, the tax rate, is far from their ideal point. So BK is their ideal point, group K, and suppose that the other groups are ordered such that this parameter is increasing. So basically, let's suppose that richer groups prefer more right-wing policies, and also they have higher AKs, means that they're generally better off. So this policy is determined in each period through a game, which the game form depends on the current institutions. What are institutions? So we assume that there are a finite set of institutions, a set S from 1 to m, and in each state is characterized by political weights that each group in the society has. For example, you can think of this as share of enfranchised individuals or the probability that people vote. Let's assume that in left, for example, that in left dictatorship is the institution where the poor have a lot of weight and the rich have very little weight. In democracy, everyone is equal. In the dictatorship, it's the other way around. And so, in each period, the society decides two things. One is the current policy, such as the tax rate, it's PT, and the other thing is the next period's institution. So they decide who will be in charge, essentially, which institution will be present in the next period. So there's economic decision and political decision, and how do they do this? They do this through a particular agenda-setting game, which we define in the paper, but let's, for the sake of time, let's not talk about this. So we sometimes, for some results, we need to assume the set of states is rich enough, but like for all practical purposes, like in this example, it suffices to assume that there is, for every group, there is a state and institution where it effectively makes decisions. What is social mobility? And that's the key. Social mobility is reallocation, reshuffling of citizens between groups. So we assume that it happens in the end of each period, and it's such that it preserves group sizes. So you should think about this as we started from some allocation of citizens, and then there was social mobility, and at some point a stationary distribution has been reached. So we studied a case where this distribution has been reached already. So we code this through a matrix of social mobility M, which captures the probability that individual from group J will move to group K in any given transition, which satisfies the two properties that we require, stochastic property and preservation of group sizes. And the key assumption that we make is there is monotonicity across individuals, meaning that the distribution of people who are richer today stochastically eliminates the distribution of those ones who are poorer today. So essentially there are no deterministic reversals of fortune, which is probably natural. The basic results here, like as you probably would expect, are that equilibrium exists, that in any equilibrium, and by equilibrium we mean market perfect equilibrium with the additional restriction on monotonicity, so there are no jumps between states back and forth, essentially, and also symmetry, meaning that all individuals from the same group are completely symmetric, they act identically. So such equilibria exist, and in any such equilibria, the decisions are as if the median voter theorem holds, essentially as if both the policy, the economic decision, and the political transition decision are made by the current effective median voter, and the effective median voter, or the effective decision maker, is the would-be median voter if the society had the groups reweighted, the size of groups reweighted with the weights corresponding to the current institution. Right. So let me give you an example of social mobility and transitions for different levels of social mobility. So let's assume that we have three groups in society, as I said, poor, middle class, and rich, and like poor have 40% of people, and middle class and the rich have 30% of individuals each. So they have preferences over real line, and they have ideal points and quadratic utilities, as I was saying. And if there is no social mobility, then you would expect that none of the groups of the people have any incentives to delegate to the other group. So you'd expect that if you start from democracy, where the middle class chooses its ideal policy, then you would end there tomorrow as well. But so you would if you start with left dictatorship or left dictatorship. So all institutions are stable in this case. But what happens if you introduce social mobility? And by social mobility here, let's take an extreme example where everyone becomes mobile, and so a certain share of the rich becomes middle class and poor, a certain share of poor or middle class becomes rich and poor, and a certain share of poor becomes rich and middle class. So there is complete reshuffling, and it just happens right away. What happens with stability of institutions? Well, first of all, the middle class, in expectation, the middle class are the green ones. They expect to be spread over the society, but and the distribution is slightly asymmetric. But by and large, the assumption is such that the kind of tomorrow's people who are currently in the middle class would, in expectation, nevertheless prefer democracy. They would rather choose policy slightly to the left, but still democracy is their ideal state, and so they would stay in democracy. So democracy is still stable. So that thing is still true, but what we have gained once we introduce social mobility is that people who are rich today, they also don't know who they will become, and in particular there is a chance that they will be in the middle class or the poor. So essentially tomorrow's self of the current rich is exactly the same as tomorrow's self of the current middle class. So tomorrow's self has exactly the same preferences, and in delegation they solve exactly the same problem, and consequently they decide to delegate to the middle class, whether you are poor now or whether you're rich now. So essentially, in some sense, not only democracy as an institution itself was stable, it also became more stable because before that, if you, for some reason, jumped out of democracy, you would not return there. Now you actually would return back. So democracy became asymptotically stable, and in this sense, more social mobility made democracy more stable. But what if we don't have full social mobility, what we have only partial social mobility? And let's depict partial social mobility in the following way. So we have the poor and you have the middle class. They become mobile, but the rich is immobile. For example, think of it as aristocracy. In this case, so this is what happens. So some middle class people become poor and the other way around. What are the incentives of different groups in this case? Well, the rich, they are where they are, they don't care. The poor, a poor person is more likely to be poor than middle class, so he'd rather stay where he is. But the difference is the current middle class person, like since the more people are poor than middle class, he also expects to be more likely to be poor than middle class tomorrow. So consequently, he would rather delegate to the poor. That's precisely something that destabilizes democracy. So if you don't have full and symmetric social mobility, but instead you have partial social mobility like here, then social mobility makes democracy less stable. So the punchline here is that full social mobility makes democracy more stable, provided that average system is close to median, but partial social mobility make democracy less stable. So it's kind of different sides of the Tocqueville's hypothesis. What are we missing here with this analysis? Well, in this kind of simple two-period logic, we anticipate that tomorrow's decision makers make policy decisions, economic decisions, but we forget that they also make political decisions, that they also decide where to move next. So to study this, we need to turn to an infinite horizon model. So let's illustrate this. So same picture, and let's suppose that social mobility happens not immediately, but kind of unravels over time. So you have some people who are poor and some people are middle class. They become mobile and they move back and forth. At the next period, they move further, and some people who became rich might go back to becoming poor, and so on. And after a while, basically, they will completely reshuffle, and we will finally come to a stationary distribution whether you are poor or middle class today will have no predictive power where you are in the long run. So if that's the case, if this is the social mobility, how would institutions evolve? Well, here's the answer. First of all, the rich not really care. Now, what happens with poor and the middle class? The poor are more likely to remain poor, so they will left-wing dictatorship will be stable. So I have 1 minute. Okay, that's. But we start kind of a bit later. No, we started later. No.
We can go for 1 minute. Within 3 or 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, good. If the middle class expects to stay in democracy forever, then expect that other middle class people will remain in democracy forever. Then instead, he would expect that his long-run distant selves would want to become poor, and consequently, he would prefer to move to left-wing dictatorship. But if he expects that tomorrow, whoever is in charge of the middle class, these middle class people would move towards the left-wing dictatorship, in that case, he'd rather wait 1 more period because in the immediate future he's going to be in the middle class. So consequently, he would rather stay. As a result, in equilibrium, he would rather transit from the middle class to the poor, but not immediately. So because of that, we would have to study mixed structure equilibrium. And in the remaining time, I would, instead of doing something else, I would probably illustrate how the combination of fast and social mobilities allows you to get multiple equilibria, so this would be important. So suppose again that you have a lot of mobility between poor and the middle class, but also on top of that you have very small mobility between middle class and rich. And so if you iterate this process long enough, then instead of full reshuffling between poor and the middle class, you get full reshuffling between all 3 groups of the society. So this is how the picture would look like. And the claim in the paper is that there are 2 equilibria in such situation. One equilibria is the middle class, the democracy is stable, the middle class doesn't want to delegate anywhere. And the intuition for this is, well, if the middle class expects democracy to persist in the long run, then of course it has a 1 period temptation to delegate to left dictatorship because there is a lot of mobility between middle class and the poor. But it knows that in the long run, it will, its long run descendants would prefer democracy again. And so if democracy is to stay, I'd rather not undertake this temptation. So in this case, the poor and the rich would gradually converge to democracy as well. So what is the other equilibrium? The other equilibrium is very different. The other equilibrium is that every person in the middle class now expects that whoever is in charge of democracy tomorrow will allow a left-wing coup, basically will delegate to the left, to the poor, so that the society transits to left-wing dictatorship. And if so, it knows that democracy is not going to persist for an extra 2 periods anyway, so basically it only makes decisions for tomorrow. And tomorrow he has preferences that coincide with preferences of the poor, so he expects to be poor rather than middle class. So because of that, he also wants to delegate, and so essentially the anticipation that democracy will not remain stable even for an extra period makes the current middle class want to abandon democracy right away. So a few words of how we do this. So we make we encode everything in terms of preferences of future selves, and then within the model. So I don't have time. If I don't have time, then I have probably would just since we have been recorded, I slowly go over all the slides, so it's visible for anybody who is viewing this presentation. And the punchline of the result is, the question is, does social mobility make democracy more stable? And the answer is yes, if democracy is preferred by descendants of the current people in the middle class, specifically if it's true if the median voter is close to average voter today. Otherwise, social mobility may make democracy less stable, and we can get more precise statements for very far-sighted agents. And we get some results with endogenous social mobility. Specifically, democracy is more likely to be stable if the middle class is sufficiently large, sufficiently thick. Democracy is stable, but the cost of this is there is unlikely to be social mobility. At the same time, if there is thin middle class, then it's more likely that there will be some social mobility, but in that case it's also likely that democracy will be undermined, though this is only possible in favor of elite dictatorship in case of upward mobility. Thank you very much.